You won't believe what this successful businessman had to go through. He simply bought an economy ticket to check his airline service, but what happened next will shock you to the core. Watch until the end to uncover the full story. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Your opinion matters. The cabin was beginning to fill up as passengers boarded Flight 437, one of the most frequently flown routes of Airstar, an airline known for providing premium services. In a quiet moment between his executive duties, Isaac Marshall, the CEO of Airstar and the owner of several airlines, decided to experience firsthand what a regular customer might encounter on one of his planes. It wasn't just about business to him, it was about his reputation, his values, and a commitment to excellence. Wearing casual clothes with no indication of his status, he hoped to travel incognito and see how the service in the economy class measured up to his company's promises. He arrived at the check-in counter well ahead of time, blending in with the crowd. He sensed a few glances here and there, a common enough experience. People didn't often expect to see a man like him alone, with no entourage, checking in without any fanfare. Nevertheless, he continued on, making his way through security, not minding the occasional suspicious look from the airport staff. He had grown used to such looks, the kind that questioned whether he belonged. Once aboard the plane, Isaac quietly took his seat, observing the interactions between the crew and other passengers. He hoped this experience would reaffirm his company's service quality, perhaps give him insights into further improvements. But there was something in the air, an almost tangible sense of unease that seemed to hover whenever his gaze met those of the flight attendants. As he settled in, a flight attendant named Carla came down the aisle, checking tickets and helping passengers store their luggage. When she reached his row, her expression changed. Instead of the friendly smile he had seen her give the passengers before him, she looked him over, her eyes narrowing. "Sir, are you in the correct seat?" she asked, her tone overly formal. Isaac nodded, showing her his ticket without a word, a calm smile on his face. He felt her glance linger on him longer than necessary, scanning him as if trying to find a reason to question him further. Reluctantly, she nodded back and continued down the aisle, muttering something under her breath. Isaac couldn't hear her words, but he noticed the pointed stairs that followed her back to the front of the cabin. As the plane filled with passengers, he continued his quiet observation, taking in the interactions around him. He hoped the initial hostility would dissipate, that Carla's tense attitude was perhaps just a passing moment of stress in a demanding job. However, as the last passenger boarded and the doors were closed, he noticed she was still glancing in his direction, her expression now one of open irritation. Soon after takeoff, Carla began the cabin service, but when she reached his row, she again seemed to pause deliberately, a hint of disdain flashing across her face. She barely acknowledged his existence, giving him a curt nod and moving quickly to the next row. "Excuse me," he called, hoping to bring a bit of civility to the interaction. "Could I get a glass of water, please?" Carla stopped, slowly turning her head toward him, her eyes scanning him from head to toe before answering. "We'll get to you when we can, sir," she said, her voice laced with impatience. "There are other people we need to serve first." Isaac held back his surprise, nodding politely, hoping she might reconsider her tone. But instead, she turned away sharply, almost in defiance, and continued down the aisle. Isaac took a deep breath. He wanted to believe it was just a misunderstanding or that Carla was having an off day, but her attitude unsettled him. He decided to let it go, determined to make the best of the experience, regardless of how unusual it felt. This was his company's flight, and as its owner, he wanted to understand every experience, from the most positive to the troubling. As the flight continued, he noticed her making rounds to other passengers, all with a pleasant smile, offering drinks and meals. Yet each time she approached his section, her expression soured, and she skipped over him as if he were invisible. The odd treatment soon extended to the rest of the crew. 2 more attendants passed by, ignoring him entirely. Frustrated but staying composed, Isaac leaned back, observing silently as the crew continued to bypass him, despite his attempts to ask politely for the standard services offered to every passenger around him. Time passed, and eventually Carla returned to his row, this time carrying a tray. Isaac felt relieved. Perhaps now she was finally going to serve him. But instead, as she leaned over, she tipped the tray, and a cup of steaming coffee spilled directly onto his face. The scalding liquid made him gasp in pain, and instinctively he wiped at his face, feeling the burn across his skin. It was more than accidental. It felt deliberate. Carla's face betrayed no surprise, no shock, only a cold, unapologetic gaze as she watched him recoil. "Oops," she said, barely concealing a smirk. "Looks like you're a bit clumsy, aren't you?" Isaac's skin was stinging, and he bit back a sharp reply. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him, their judgmental stares making the sting of the burn feel even sharper. He tried to meet Carla's gaze with calm resolve, hoping she might show a hint of remorse or apology, but she only looked at him with a barely concealed scorn. "Could you at least bring me a napkin?" he managed, keeping his voice steady. "Sorry, sir, we're all out. Busy flight," she said before turning away, not even glancing back as she moved on. Isaac felt a surge of anger rise within him. He had expected professionalism, respect, even basic kindness, values he had always strived to embed in his company's ethos. But here he was, treated as though he were less than any other passenger. It went against every principle he believed in, every standard he had set. As the flight continued, he sat in silence, allowing the pain on his skin to remind him of why he was here. The hostile treatment, the quiet stares, the coldness, each small insult added up, turning his experience into something much darker than he had anticipated. But this was only the beginning. He would continue observing, holding back his true identity, determined to understand the depth of the issues he was witnessing. If this was the treatment one of his own airlines allowed, then there was more at stake here than just one flight. He knew that change would come one way or another, but for now he waited, biding his time until the moment to reveal himself arrived. Isaac sat quietly in his seat, his face still stinging from the scalding coffee Carla had intentionally spilled on him. He felt the weight of the stares around him as though each passenger had silently judged him for what had happened without knowing the truth. But he forced himself to stay calm, knowing that revealing his identity now would only shift the focus. He was here to observe, to understand the true quality of service his airline offered to all its customers. Yet, what he was beginning to witness was far worse than he had expected. As the flight attendants continued their rounds, it became clear that Carla's behavior was not an isolated incident. Soon, a second steward named Mark approached Isaac's row, serving food to each passenger. Isaac raised a hand to signal for a meal, only to have Mark pause, glance at him with a look of disdain, and then move on as if he hadn't seen him at all. Isaac's stomach grumbled, but he swallowed his frustration, determined to keep observing. Each denial, each cold shoulder, each dismissive glance chipped away at the courteous demeanor he had trained himself to maintain. After a few more minutes, Isaac decided to try again, waiting until Mark passed by on his return trip. This time he called out politely, "Excuse me, sir, may I get something to eat?" Mark stopped, his face hardening as he turned to look at Isaac. "Sorry, we're out of meals," he said, his voice void of any sympathy. "You should have asked earlier." Isaac glanced down the aisle, seeing meals still being distributed, but he held back his response, nodding instead. He sensed that this attitude was more than just a coincidence. A troubling question began to form in his mind. How often did his employees treat passengers like this? He had built his company on the principles of respect and equality, but here he was, experiencing the exact opposite. Isaac sat back, watching Mark continue down the aisle, the weight of what he was learning settling heavily on his shoulders. His own employees were treating him, the owner, as less than human simply because they thought he was an ordinary man, a nobody in their eyes. He could see the cold amusement in their faces, the satisfaction they seemed to get from withholding even the smallest courtesy. And worse yet, he sensed an unspoken agreement among the staff that he was somehow a problem, someone undeserving of the basic respect given to others. Isaac's patience was wearing thin, but he reminded himself of his purpose. He had come on this flight to see the truth, and now that he was seeing it, he knew he had to endure, to understand every aspect of what was unfolding. So he sat quietly, observing the silent pact of disrespect and noting every detail. Then, just as he was gathering his thoughts, Carla returned to his row, pausing beside him. Isaac looked up, a faint hope that she might finally acknowledge him with some respect, but her expression was anything but friendly. Her eyes narrowed, her lips curved in a smirk, and without a word, she dropped a cup of water on the tray in front of him. The water sloshed over the edge, spilling onto his lap. "Careful, wouldn't want to make a mess," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Though it seems like you're used to it." Isaac felt the cold water soak through his pants, but he maintained his composure, looking directly at her with a calm expression. He wanted to see if there was any flicker of regret in her face, any hint that she recognized her behavior as inappropriate. But her smirk only widened, and she turned away, leaving him drenched and humiliated. The other passengers around him averted their eyes, perhaps embarrassed by the scene or uncomfortable with the open hostility. Isaac wondered if any of them would have said something if they knew who he really was. But then he realized that was precisely the point. These people didn't know, and that was why he was here. Hours passed, and the hostile treatment continued. Each time Carla or Mark walked by, they ignored his presence completely, even when he tried to ask for a napkin to dry himself. Isaac sat in silence, feeling the discomfort of the wet fabric clinging to his skin, each denial adding to the growing sense of frustration. It wasn't just the lack of service. It was the deliberate, calculated way they refused to acknowledge his existence, treating him as though he were invisible, someone who didn't matter. Finally, nearing the end of the meal service, he saw Carla approach again, this time carrying a fresh tray. Isaac's stomach ached with hunger, but he had given up hope that they would serve him. She stopped beside him, lifting the tray with a theatrical gesture, and looked down at him with a disdainful smile. "Don't suppose you're still waiting for food, are you?" she asked, her voice dripping with contempt. Isaac didn't respond, keeping his gaze steady, watching her with quiet intensity. Carla tilted her head, pretending to think. "No, I don't think so. You don't look like you need anything else, do you?" She chuckled, and Mark joined her, both of them sharing a smug smile. It was at that moment that Isaac realized the extent of their cruelty. This wasn't just poor service, it was targeted humiliation. These people, his own employees, were mocking him openly, feeling justified in their disdain simply because of his appearance. He felt a flash of anger, but kept it under control, knowing that his patience was reaching its end. As the plane began its descent, Carla and Mark passed by one last time, their voices lowered but their mocking laughter unmistakable. Isaac listened to them, every insult and every slight etched into his memory. He had come here to learn the truth, and now he had it, laid bare before him. The respect he had once believed was foundational to his airline was nothing more than a thin veneer, hiding the prejudice lurking underneath. When the wheels touched down and the passengers began to prepare for disembarkation, Carla turned to him one last time, her smirk firmly in place. "Have a nice day," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Isaac nodded, his expression calm, though inside he was anything but. The moment of truth had come, and he could feel the weight of what he was about to reveal. But for now, he held back, letting them think they had won, that they had succeeded in treating him as less than human. But as he stood to leave, he caught a glimpse of himself in the small mirror on the seat back, his reflection staring back at him. He looked weary but resolved, every ounce of his dignity intact despite the relentless barrage of insults. He knew that he had held on for a reason, and soon they would understand exactly who he was. And with that, he gathered his belongings, ready to deliver the justice they would never see coming. Isaac took a deep breath as the plane finally touched down. Despite everything he had endured during the flight, he was determined to keep calm, to maintain his composure as he prepared to disembark. But just as he stood to gather his belongings, he noticed Carla and Mark watching him from the aisle, their expressions hardening as he approached the front of the plane. "Sir, we need you to sit back down," Carla said, her tone laced with cold authority. She blocked his path, her face a mask of disdain. Isaac glanced around, confused. "The plane has landed. Isn't it time to disembark?" "We have a few things to discuss before you go anywhere," she replied, casting a glance over her shoulder as if to signal someone else. Isaac felt a prickling sense of unease as Mark approached, standing behind Carla with his arms crossed, his posture defensive. Before Isaac could respond, Carla looked him over with open suspicion. "We've had several complaints about your behavior," she announced, her voice raised so that nearby passengers could hear. "Other passengers have mentioned that you were being disruptive during the flight, causing a disturbance." Isaac's mouth dropped open in surprise. He had barely spoken a word since the flight began, and now they were accusing him of being disruptive? "That's not true," he replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I didn't cause any disturbance." Mark stepped closer, his expression darkening. "Look, sir, we don't know why you're here, but this isn't the place to act out. You've been making loud noises, refusing to follow instructions, and generally making the flight uncomfortable for other passengers." Isaac could feel the heat rise to his face, a mixture of frustration and disbelief washing over him. "I have done none of those things. I've been sitting here quietly the entire time." Carla sneered. "That's not what we heard. You're a disruption, and we're asking you to cooperate with us. Otherwise, we'll have to involve security." Isaac held his breath, struggling to contain his frustration. He could see the other passengers looking on, their faces a mix of discomfort and curiosity. This was an open spectacle now, a public accusation designed to humiliate him even further. "Look," Isaac said, his voice calm but firm, I've done nothing wrong. I've complied with every instruction given to me, and I would appreciate it if you would allow me to leave the plane." But Carla merely crossed her arms, giving him a look that bordered on contempt. "You're not going anywhere until we've sorted this out." At that moment, one of the pilots emerged from the cockpit, his gaze immediately falling on Isaac. Isaac felt a chill run down his spine as the pilot, a tall, imposing man named Jackson, walked over, his expression twisted in irritation. "What's the problem here?" Jackson demanded, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Isaac. "This passenger has been causing trouble," Carla replied quickly, casting Isaac a withering glance. "He's been loud, disruptive, and, frankly, we don't feel safe allowing him to disembark until we've contacted security." Isaac felt his patience snap. "I'm not a threat to anyone here," he replied, his tone clipped but controlled. "I'm simply trying to leave, just like every other passenger." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Jackson stepped closer, his face contorting with irritation as he looked Isaac up and down. "We don't tolerate disorderly conduct on our flights," Jackson said, his voice low and menacing, "and we don't take kindly to passengers who think they're above the rules." Isaac tried to respond, but before he could get a word in, Jackson reached out and grabbed him by the arm, his grip firm and unyielding. Isaac felt a surge of shock as the pilot physically restrained him, yanking him backward with surprising force. "What are you doing?" Isaac protested, struggling against Jackson's grip, but Jackson only tightened his hold, his eyes flashing with anger. "Stop resisting," Jackson growled. "You've been given a direct instruction to stay seated, and now you're refusing to comply. This behavior is unacceptable." Isaac's heart pounded as he realized the full extent of their intentions. This was no longer just an act of hostility. It was an outright display of aggression, a power play meant to put him in his place. "Please, I'm just trying to leave," Isaac said, his voice strained as he attempted to free his arm. But Jackson ignored him, tightening his grip even further as he shoved Isaac back into his seat. Before Isaac could process what was happening, Mark approached with a pair of handcuffs, his expression cold and unforgiving. "Since you're refusing to cooperate, we'll have to restrain you," Mark said, his voice devoid of empathy. Isaac stared at him in disbelief, his mind racing. This was a nightmare, a horrific scene unfolding before his eyes. He had come here to observe, to understand the true experience of his passengers, but now he was being treated as a criminal, an object of scorn and derision. Before he could protest further, Mark snapped the handcuffs onto his wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin. Isaac winced, feeling the humiliation wash over him in waves as he was forcibly restrained. "There," Mark said, his tone smug as he stepped back to admire his work. "Maybe now you'll understand the consequences of causing a disturbance." Isaac tried to keep his composure, but he could feel the weight of his anger building. He had done nothing to deserve this treatment, nothing to warrant such brutality. But they saw him as less than human, someone unworthy of respect or compassion, and now they had made him a prisoner on his own plane. Jackson gestured for him to lie down on the floor, his voice harsh and commanding. "You're going to stay down there until we say otherwise." Isaac hesitated, but the look in Jackson's eyes told him that compliance was the only option. Reluctantly, he lowered himself to the floor, feeling the cold metal of the handcuffs digging into his wrists as he lay there, exposed and vulnerable. As he lay on the floor, he could hear the hushed whispers of the other passengers, their voices filled with a mixture of shock and curiosity. But no one spoke up. No one challenged the crew's actions. He was utterly alone, isolated in his suffering, Each time he attempted to shift or adjust his position, Mark would appear, delivering a swift, painful shove or kick to remind him of his place. "Stay still," Mark snarled, his voice filled with contempt. "You're not going anywhere until we say so." Isaac gritted his teeth, the pain and humiliation blending into a searing rage that burned within him. He had come here to observe, to learn the truth about his company's service. And now he had it, laid bare before him in all its cruelty. Time seemed to drag on as he lay there, each second stretching into an eternity. He could feel the ache in his limbs, the cold bite of the handcuffs, the sting of every insult and indignity. But through it all, he held on to one thought, the knowledge that soon they would understand the full extent of their mistake. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the announcement came over the intercom, signaling that it was time to disembark. Isaac lay still, waiting for the crew to release him, to grant him the dignity of standing on his own 2 feet. But instead, Jackson and Mark exchanged a glance, their faces twisted with satisfaction. "You stay right where you are," Jackson said, his voice dripping with malice. "We'll tell security to deal with you when we land." Isaac felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to remain calm, to hold on to his dignity. He knew that his moment of revelation was coming, that soon they would see him for who he truly was. But for now, he would wait, enduring their cruelty with silent resolve. As the plane came to a stop, he lay there, handcuffed and humiliated, his mind racing with the weight of everything he had experienced. He had seen the truth, felt it in every insult, every blow, every calculated act of disrespect, and he knew, with a certainty that burned within him, that justice would soon be served. Isaac lay on the cold, hard floor of the plane, his wrists bound tightly by handcuffs that bit into his skin with every slight movement. Each attempt to shift his position, to find even a small measure of comfort, was met with a quick, aggressive shove from Mark or a swift kick to keep him down. The cruelty in their actions was undeniable, each shove and kick delivered with a satisfaction that bordered on gleeful. He could feel their disdain, their willingness to see him suffer as if he were less than human. Time seemed to move slowly, each minute stretching into an eternity as he lay there. The noise of other passengers gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark, reached his ears like a distant hum. He could hear them whispering, murmuring in tones that ranged from discomfort to curiosity. He felt the weight of their judgment, their silence complicit in his suffering, each of them witnesses, yet none daring to speak out against the injustice unfolding before them. Isaac held his breath, trying to steady his mind, to center himself amid the rising tide of anger and humiliation. He had come here to understand, to see his company's service from the eyes of an everyday customer. But he had never anticipated this, a descent into cruelty, a display of contempt that stripped him of his dignity and left him feeling powerless. He was Isaac Marshall, a man who had built his company on principles of respect and integrity. Yet here he lay, reduced to a prisoner, handcuffed on the floor of his own plane. As he lay there, trying to keep his emotions in check, Mark approached once more, standing over him with a look of satisfaction. "Stay put," Mark sneered. "Don't think about moving a muscle." Isaac clenched his jaw, willing himself to remain calm, to endure just a little longer. He knew that his moment of revelation was coming, that soon they would understand the full extent of their mistake. But each passing second chipped away at his resolve, the humiliation and anger building up inside him like a storm waiting to be unleashed. In the distance, he heard the intercom crackle to life, the pilot's voice coming over the speakers to announce that the plane had landed and passengers were free to disembark. Isaac lay still, waiting for the moment when the crew would release him, allow him the simple dignity of standing on his own 2 feet. But Jackson and Mark had other plans. They exchanged a quick glance, a smirk passing between them as they looked down at Isaac, relishing his helplessness. "You're staying right where you are," Jackson said, his voice cold and commanding. "We'll let airport security handle you." Isaac felt a surge of anger, the words like a spark igniting the frustration and indignation that had been simmering within him since the beginning of the flight. He wanted to speak, to reveal his true identity, to show them who they were really dealing with, but he held back, forcing himself to stay silent, to wait just a little longer. He knew that his patience would soon pay off, that justice was waiting just around the corner. As the last of the passengers filed out of the plane, he felt the weight of the crew's gaze on him, each of them looking down at him with a mixture of contempt and satisfaction. He saw Carla in the corner of his eye, her arms crossed and a smug smile on her face as she watched him lie there, bound and humiliated. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "I hope you enjoyed the flight." Isaac said nothing, his face a mask of calm as he met her gaze. He wanted her to see the strength in his eyes, the silent promise that her actions would not go unpunished. But for now, he would let her revel in her victory, knowing that the tables would soon turn. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, 2 security officers boarded the plane, their faces blank and expressionless as they took in the scene before them. Carla gestured to Isaac, her voice full of authority as she spoke to the officers. "This passenger has been causing trouble," she said, her tone self-righteous and filled with false concern. "He refused to follow instructions, disrupted the flight, and became aggressive toward the crew. We had no choice but to restrain him." Isaac watched as the officers looked him over, their faces unreadable as they took in his disheveled appearance, the handcuffs biting into his wrists, the remnants of coffee stains on his shirt. He could see the judgment in their eyes, the way they viewed him as nothing more than a problem to be dealt with. "Sir," one of the officers said, his tone flat and indifferent, "we're going to need you to come with us." Isaac held his ground, his voice steady as he spoke. "I've done nothing wrong," he said, looking directly at the officer. "These people are lying." Carla let out a sharp laugh, her eyes glinting with satisfaction as she crossed her arms. "Lying? Why would we lie? The entire crew can vouch for what happened. You were disruptive, and we had to protect the safety of our passengers." Isaac felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to remain calm, to keep his voice steady. He knew that revealing his identity now would only complicate matters, that it would be better to wait until he was off the plane and in a more controlled environment. "Sir," the officer said, his patience thinning, "we're not here to debate. Please come with us." Isaac nodded, feeling the weight of his frustration settle heavily on his shoulders. He had no choice but to comply, to follow these officers off the plane and face whatever awaited him outside. But he knew that his moment of truth was coming, that soon he would have the opportunity to reveal his true identity and expose the cruelty and prejudice that had unfolded on this flight. As the officers led him down the aisle, he felt the stares of the crew on his back, their smug smiles and self-satisfied expressions burning into his memory. He made a silent promise to himself in that moment, a promise that he would see each of them held accountable for their actions, that he would make sure they faced the consequences of their cruelty. Once they reached the exit, the officers led him down the steps and onto the tarmac, the cold air biting at his skin as he took his first breath of freedom. But the handcuffs still bound his wrists, a constant reminder of the injustice he had just endured. As they walked toward the terminal, one of the officers finally removed the handcuffs, his expression softening slightly as he looked at Isaac. "You're free to go," he said, his voice low. Isaac met the officer's gaze, his eyes hard with resolve. "Thank you," he replied, his tone even but firm, "but I'm not done here." The officer gave him a curious look but said nothing, merely nodding as he stepped back, allowing Isaac to make his way into the terminal. As he entered the airport, Isaac felt a surge of determination rise within him. He knew that he had a responsibility, not only to himself, but to every passenger who had ever been subjected to the same cruelty and disrespect he had just experienced. He had seen the truth, felt it in every insult, every act of aggression, and now he was ready to bring that truth to light. He made his way to the airline's office within the terminal, his mind racing with the weight of everything he had endured. He knew that his actions would have consequences, that exposing the truth would shake the foundations of his company. But he also knew that it was necessary, that change could only come from confronting the darkness that had festered within his organization. As he approached the office, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. He could feel the eyes of the staff on him as he entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disbelief. They didn't recognize him, didn't know who he was or why he was here. But that was about to change. With a steady hand, he reached for his identification, holding it out to the receptionist with a calm, resolute expression. "I'm Isaac Marshall," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I'm the owner of this airline, and I need to speak to whoever is in charge immediately." The receptionist's eyes widened in shock, her face paling as she took in the significance of his words. She stammered out a quick response, gesturing for him to wait as she hurriedly made a call, her voice filled with a newfound respect and urgency. Isaac waited, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and resolve. He knew that this was just the beginning, that the journey he was about to embark on would be difficult and painful. But he also knew that it was necessary, that justice demanded nothing less. And as he stood there, waiting for the meeting that would set everything into motion, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had endured the worst, had seen the truth in all its cruelty, and now he was ready to bring that truth to light, to ensure that no one would ever suffer as he had on this flight. For Isaac Marshall, the battle had only just begun. Isaac stood in the quiet of the airline office, his heart still racing from the anger and humiliation he had endured on the flight. The memory of Carla's smirk, Mark's sneers, and Jackson's cold brutality was fresh in his mind. Yet, as he waited to speak to the airline's top manager at the terminal, he felt a new sense of resolve hardening within him. This was the moment he had waited for, the moment when the truth would come to light, and those who had wronged him would face the full consequences of their actions. The receptionist looked at him with a mixture of shock and awe, her hands trembling as she made the call to the head manager, relaying his identity in a hurried whisper. Isaac watched her, noticing the change in her demeanor the moment she realized he was the owner of the airline. He was no longer an anonymous passenger to her. He was Isaac Marshall, the man behind the very company she worked for. "Mr. Marshall, our operations manager will be with you shortly," she said, her voice filled with newfound respect. She gestured to a comfortable seat nearby, but Isaac remained standing, his gaze steady and unyielding. Within minutes, a man in a crisp suit entered the room, his expression a mix of confusion and concern as he approached Isaac. He extended his hand, but Isaac merely nodded, his posture rigid as he waited for the man to speak. "Mr. Marshall, I'm Thomas Avery, head of operations," the man said, his voice filled with deference. "I was informed that you had an urgent matter to discuss. Please, how can we assist you?" Isaac held the man's gaze, his voice calm but laced with authority. "I just arrived on one of your flights, Flight 437, he began, "and I think it's safe to say I didn't receive the treatment that any passenger, let alone the owner of this airline, deserves." Thomas's face paled, and he looked around nervously. "I'm very sorry to hear that, Mr. Marshall. Could you tell me what happened?" For the next several minutes, Isaac recounted every detail of the flight, his voice measured and controlled as he described the treatment he had endured. He spoke of Carla's blatant disrespect, her cold refusal to serve him, and the calculated cruelty of spilling hot coffee on his face. He described Mark's cold indifference, the aggressive remarks, and the moment when Jackson, the pilot, had physically assaulted him, restraining him with handcuffs and forcing him to lie on the floor like a criminal. With each word, he saw Thomas's expression shift from confusion to disbelief, then finally to horror. By the time Isaac finished, Thomas was visibly shaken, his face drained of color as he struggled to process what he had just heard. "Mr. Marshall, I don't know what to say," Thomas stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't believe. I had no idea." Isaac's eyes narrowed, his voice sharp. "Believe it. I experienced it firsthand. And if this is how my own employees treat a passenger who they consider undeserving, then we have a much larger problem on our hands." Thomas swallowed hard, nodding in agreement. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Marshall. I assure you, this is not the standard of service we strive for. I will personally see to it that the individuals responsible are held accountable." Isaac held up a hand, silencing Thomas. "I don't want promises, Mr. Avery. I want action. Effective immediately, I want every member of that crew, Carla, Mark, Jackson, and anyone else who supported their behavior, removed from duty. I also want this incident documented in their records, and I expect a full investigation into how they managed to remain employed in the first place." Thomas nodded quickly, pulling out a notepad and scribbling down Isaac's instructions, his hand shaking slightly as he wrote. "Understood, sir. I'll see to it right away." Isaac studied him for a moment, assessing his sincerity. He could see that Thomas was genuinely horrified by what had happened, but he wasn't ready to place his trust so easily. Too much had been revealed during that flight, too many cracks in the foundation he had once believed to be solid. "There's one more thing, Mr. Avery," Isaac said, his tone softening slightly but retaining its edge. "I want to address the crew personally. I want them to know exactly who I am and understand the full extent of their actions." Thomas's eyes widened, and he hesitated for a brief moment before nodding. "Of course, Mr. Marshall. I'll have them brought to a private conference room immediately." Isaac nodded, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him as Thomas left to arrange the meeting. He knew that facing the crew would be difficult, that the confrontation would be a test of his own restraint. But he also knew that it was necessary, that they needed to see him, to know the truth of who he was and what they had done. After a few minutes, Thomas returned, his expression tense as he gestured for Isaac to follow. "They're waiting for you in the conference room, sir," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of dread and respect. Isaac followed him down a narrow corridor, his footsteps echoing in the quiet as they approached a door at the end of the hall. Thomas opened it, revealing a small conference room where Carla, Mark, and Jackson sat, their expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed irritation. The moment Isaac entered, the atmosphere shifted. Carla's eyes widened in shock as she recognized him, her smug expression vanishing as the realization dawned on her. Mark looked equally stunned, his mouth falling open as he glanced between Isaac and Thomas. But it was Jackson's reaction that brought a flicker of satisfaction to Isaac's heart. The pilot's face went pale, his gaze fixed on Isaac with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Isaac took a deep breath, allowing the silence to settle over the room before he spoke. "I'm sure you all recognize me now," he began, his voice calm but carrying an edge that sent a shiver down their spines. "I am Isaac Marshall, the owner of this airline, and you've all made a grave mistake." Carla looked away, her face flushed with shame, while Mark and Jackson exchanged nervous glances, their confidence shattered in an instant. "For the duration of that flight," Isaac continued, his gaze sweeping over each of them, "you treated me as if I were less than human. You ignored me, humiliated me, and subjected me to physical abuse, all because you assumed I was just another passenger." He paused, letting his words sink in, watching as the weight of his accusations bore down on them. "You thought you could act with impunity, that there would be no consequences for your actions, but you were wrong." Jackson cleared his throat, his voice shaky as he attempted to explain. "Mr. Marshall, if I had known—" Isaac cut him off with a sharp gesture. "It shouldn't matter who I am. Whether I'm the owner of this airline or an everyday customer, I deserve the same respect and courtesy you would show anyone else. But instead, you chose to treat me, and by extension anyone who doesn't meet your standards, as disposable." Carla's face crumpled, her eyes filling with tears as she stammered out a desperate apology. "Mr. Marshall, please, I didn't mean— I thought—" Isaac held up a hand, silencing her. "Spare me your apologies. They mean nothing to me. Your actions have spoken louder than any words ever could." Mark shifted uncomfortably, his face pale as he struggled to meet Isaac's gaze. Is there anything we can do to make this right?" Isaac's eyes narrowed, his voice cold. "There's nothing you can do to erase what's been done. But there are consequences. Effective immediately, you're all terminated from your positions within this airline. Your records will reflect the nature of your actions, and I will personally ensure that this incident is known to anyone who considers hiring you in the future." A heavy silence fell over the room as the weight of his words sank in. Carla's face crumpled as she began to cry, her tears falling silently as she realized the magnitude of her actions. Mark looked down, his face pale and defeated, while Jackson clenched his fists, his expression one of barely concealed rage. Isaac watched them, feeling a sense of justice settle over him. He had endured their cruelty, their humiliation, but now he had reclaimed his dignity. He had shown them the truth of who he was, and they would never forget it. "I hope this serves as a lesson," Isaac said, his tone final, "that every passenger who boards one of my flights is deserving of respect, regardless of their appearance or background, and I will not tolerate anything less." With that, he turned and left the room, his heart heavy but resolute. He knew that the battle for change was far from over, that there was still work to be done to root out the prejudice and cruelty that had infected his company. But he was ready to face that challenge, to rebuild his airline on a foundation of respect and integrity. As he walked away, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had seen the worst of humanity on that flight, but he had also found the strength to rise above it, to ensure that justice was served. For Isaac Marshall, the journey had only just begun. Isaac left the conference room with a resolute step, the weight of his decision finally settling in his mind. Every detail of his ordeal on Flight 437 had etched itself into his memory. He had endured hours of humiliation, disdain, and open hostility at the hands of his own employees, people he had entrusted to uphold the very values his airline claimed to embody. But he had reclaimed his dignity. And now, justice was being served. As he walked down the corridor, his assistant approached him, her face a mixture of concern and respect. "Mr. Marshall, I've arranged for a car to take you to your hotel. Is there anything else you need right now?" Isaac shook his head, giving her a brief but appreciative nod. "No, thank you. I'll handle things from here." With a heavy heart but steady resolve, he walked toward the main terminal, his mind already planning the next steps. He would not stop with merely firing Carla, Mark, and Jackson. The situation required more than that. It called for a full investigation into the standards of service and an overhaul of the training protocols that had allowed such prejudice to flourish unchecked. But before anything else, he knew he had to take one final step. Turning back to his assistant, he said, "Get in touch with our legal team. I want every measure taken to ensure that this crew faces the full consequences of their actions, not just termination, but criminal charges where applicable. I'll leave it to the attorneys to determine the specifics." His assistant's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded without question, already moving to relay his orders. Isaac knew that this decision would draw attention, that it would inevitably lead to questions and media scrutiny, but he was prepared for it. In fact, he welcomed it. If the world needed to see what he had endured on his own plane to understand the importance of accountability, then so be it. As he reached the terminal, he spotted Carla, Mark, and Jackson being escorted by security personnel. Their faces were drawn, pale with fear and disbelief, each of them still struggling to grasp the reality of their situation. Carla's eyes were red, and she looked at him with a mixture of desperation and regret, as if hoping for some last-minute reprieve. Mark was biting his lip, his face twisted in frustration, while Jackson clenched his fists, his gaze defiant even in the face of dismissal. Isaac held their stares, his expression unwavering. He could see the pleas in their eyes, the silent requests for forgiveness that none of them dared to voice aloud. But he remained resolute, his face a mask of calm determination. There would be no forgiveness, not for the cruelty, the humiliation, or the complete disregard for human dignity they had shown him. Carla took a step forward, her voice choked with emotion. "Mr. Marshall, please. I'm so sorry. I didn't know." Isaac raised a hand, silencing her. "You didn't know?" he repeated, his voice low but cutting. "You didn't know that a human being deserves respect, regardless of who they are? You didn't know that it's unacceptable to spill hot coffee on someone's face, to restrain them with handcuffs, to force them to lie on the floor like a criminal?" She looked down, unable to meet his gaze, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I was wrong. I don't know what came over me." Isaac's eyes narrowed, his voice firm. "What came over you was prejudice and a lack of basic decency. And you will face the consequences of that, just as anyone else would." Mark stepped forward, his expression filled with desperation. "Mr. Marshall, please. I've worked for this airline for years. I've never done anything like this before. Can't you just give us another chance?" Isaac looked at him unflinching. "One chance was all you needed to prove who you really are. And you showed me. I trusted my employees to represent the values of the company. You betrayed that trust." Jackson opened his mouth to protest, his face twisted with anger. "This is all just a misunderstanding. You're blowing it out of proportion. We did what we had to do to control a disruptive passenger." Isaac's expression hardened, his voice cold. "Disruptive? You were the ones who created that disruption." "I followed every instruction, remained calm, and asked for nothing beyond common courtesy. But you treated me as less than human. And now, you expect me to forgive you?" Jackson fell silent, his face paling as he realized that his words held no power here. There was nothing he could say, no defense that could justify his actions. Isaac took a deep breath, letting his gaze sweep over each of them. This company was built on principles of respect and integrity, principles that you have violated in the most fundamental way. Effective immediately, you're no longer employees of this airline, and I've instructed our legal team to pursue any necessary charges against you for the assault and mistreatment you inflicted. A tense silence filled the room as the weight of his words sank in. Carla's face crumpled, her shoulders shaking as she began to cry, her tears falling silently in a mixture of regret and desperation. Mark looked down, his face pale with the realization of what he had lost, while Jackson clenched his fists, his jaw tight as he struggled to maintain his composure. Isaac watched them, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. He had hoped that his employees would embody the values he had worked so hard to instill, that they would treat every passenger with the dignity and respect they deserved. But the events of this flight had revealed a darker truth, a truth that could not be ignored or forgiven. "I hope this serves as a lesson," Isaac said, his voice calm but filled with a sense of finality. "That every passenger who boards one of my flights is deserving of respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from, and I will not tolerate anything less." He turned away, leaving them to the consequences of their actions, his heart heavy but resolute. He knew that there would be more work to do, that the culture of his company would need to be examined and reformed from the ground up. But he was prepared for that challenge, determined to build an airline that truly reflected his values. As he walked toward the exit, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had endured the worst of humanity on that flight, but he had also found the strength to rise above it, to ensure that justice was served. Outside the terminal, Isaac looked up at the sky, feeling the weight of his experience lift slightly. He had come face to face with the prejudice and cruelty that still existed in the world, but he had also seen the power of accountability, the importance of standing up for what was right. And as he stood there, he knew that he would continue to fight for those values, that he would work tirelessly to ensure that his airline became a place where every passenger was treated with the respect they deserved. For Isaac Marshall, this journey had been a painful one, but it was also a reminder of his purpose. He would use this experience as a catalyst for change, a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of justice. And as he walked away, leaving the terminal behind him, he felt a renewed sense of determination. This was only the beginning, and he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Isaac Marshall's story is a powerful reminder that everyone deserves respect, regardless of status or appearance. What began as a simple flight turned into a journey that revealed harsh truths within his own company. But Isaac chose to take a stand, ensuring that no one else would suffer such treatment. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button to stay updated on other captivating stories. Leave a comment below about what you would have done in Isaac's place. Your opinion matters. Outside the terminal, Isaac looked up at the sky, feeling the weight of his experience lift slightly. He had come face to face with the prejudice and cruelty that still existed in the world, but he had also seen the power of accountability, the importance of standing up for what was right. And as he stood there, he knew that he would continue to fight for those values, that he would work tirelessly to ensure that his airline became a place where every passenger was treated with the respect they deserved. For Isaac Marshall, this journey had been a painful one, but it was also a reminder of his purpose. He would use this experience as a catalyst for change, a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of justice. And as he walked away, leaving the terminal behind him, he felt a renewed sense of determination. This was only the beginning, and he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Isaac Marshall's story is a powerful reminder that everyone deserves respect, regardless of status or appearance. What began as a simple flight turned into a journey that revealed harsh truths within his own company. But Isaac chose to take a stand, ensuring that no one else would suffer such treatment. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button to stay updated on other captivating stories. Leave a comment below about what you would have done in Isaac's place. Your opinion matters.